for another piece of terrain. I found this inspirational image by Igor Gulyuk and decided to doodle up some rough images to work from, because to try and recreate this thing, well, it's rather big and exceedingly complicated. Yeesh, it would take up half the board. Anyways, I wanted to focus on that main central area with the columns and balconies, and then have some demolished side walls with maybe a hint of Imperium churchiness to them. Now, the raw material I am going to use is a good old empty box of wine, because it has some large panels and it's pretty dense and sturdy. I trimmed out the main raw areas I wanted to use and began marking out where the windows and doors would be. Since coming to the States, I have had to endure imperial measurements, and this is the first time in ages I am going to get to play with my beloved and long-lost metric system. I now feel so nostalgic for home. I mean, feet, inches and yards are great, but it's annoying to have to carry around a converter calculator as though it's my car keys, so I'm able to divide something like 7 feet 5 1/8 inches into 3 quickly and on the fly. First problem is scale. What sort of sizes am I going to be working with? Normally for this, I have been relying on Little Baldy, a figure who came free with a starter set of Army Painter products. My tyrannids are hard to use to judge for scale, so this dude comes in well handy, but for some reason I just can't find the little git. You better have not eaten him, Bento. Yeah, I'm looking at you. So instead I'm going to have to do some research. I finally found this image. Okay, at this scale 3 centimeters is about 6 feet. I marked out what was going to be the partial height wall to the windowsill and went with 1.5 centimeters, about waist height. The window is marked up to 3.5 centimeters and then an additional 2 where I'm going to curve up and create an arch, making the entire window 5.5 centimeters. Then there is a gap of 2 centimeters and an allocation of 0.25 centimeters for the thickness of the cardboard that will be acting as the floor, and then repeat. 1.5 for the wall, 5.5 for the window, and 2 more of wall before the next floor. I centered an opening for double doors on the ground floor for what used to be a nice grand entrance before the building was demolished. The balcony doors are 2 centimeters wide and are the same height as the windows, because I'm going to leave a lintel to create some nice arched transom windows above each.
I've always wondered, what is that thing over the door called? That's a lintel.
After marking out the windows and doors, I started using my X-Acto knife to carefully cut out the shapes. I also marked out the areas I wanted to cut away from where the building collapsed from damage. I cut out several strips of chipboard, a little deeper than the depth of the wine box cardboard, and marked out 2 centimeter wide rectangles that I could place in the windows to serve as the sill. I then cut out 1.5 centimeter wide strips of wine box cardboard to be the pilasters, those raised columns projecting from the exterior wall between the windows. I then committed and removed the jagged ends for the collapsed walls. The balconies are 8.5 centimeter squares, and I cut them out from the wine box cardboard and also a big rectangle, and marked out a facade for a smooth, seamless front for the columns and the balconies. Rather than try and create a box for the columns, I simply cut out several more strips of wine box cardboard, 1 centimeter wide, and placed them on top of each other to create square support columns for the front end of the balconies. I glued them together and got a piece of packing cardboard on top of it, dropped a big fat candle on as a weight to compress them, and left them to dry. I also laid out the building front with the pilasters and dropped the chipboard on top, added more candles to press down, and left everything to glue in peace. While this dried, I began marking out the side of the building with the same dimensions as the front with the arched windows, but no balconies or doors. I then cut out strips of thin cardboard and glued them to the sides of the balcony columns to help conceal the layers of cardboard and their interiors. I put them in position and glued them in place using blue masking tape to help hold them in position while everything dried, freeing me up to continue playing with other stuff. I cut out and added window sills and pilasters for the side of the building and moved back to the balconies. I cut out some chipboard strips for the upper balconies as a sort of curb perimeter, glued them in place flush with the bottom of the balconies and added tape to hold them there. To ensure some sticking power, I hot glued the side of the building into place and then slotted in the rest of the chipboard so I could mark out the footprint of the ground floor. Once I marked out this footprint, I cut a nice raggedy line with my knife. I was going to repeat this for floors 1 and 2, but you know what? Floors are not this thin. Now, it was Remembrance Weekend when I was making this, and YouTubers that I enjoy were watching relevant war movies, and I had these react videos on in the background while I was working. One of them was checking Saving Private Ryan for the first time, and I spotted this scene in the finale in Ramel. So the demolished floors here look very similar to the cardboard packing I used for the shipping silos in my previous terrain attempt, and that had just been pinning down cardboard to help it dry. So I grabbed them, marked out the footprint and cut a nice ragged edge. In my initial drawing plan, I had anticipated just using cardboard or chipboard for floor, and so was concerned about this floor sagging or not being able to support a lot of figures, which is why I planned on a couple of structural columns made from the solid straws from my Beach Please drinking cups. They would not only represent support columns, but act as them as well, to help hold the edges of the floor up. But the packing I am now using is very dense, so I probably do not need the straw, but I decided to use it anyway because it looks rather good. Cutting 2 holes through the floors, I shoved the straw into position, a dab of glue, and left it to dry. I cut out bits of old normal drinking straws, bits of wire, bits of cut up cotton buds or Q-tips, and lots of little bits of thin wire which I used pliers to twist and turn before inserting all this material to represent conduits, pipes, rebar, HVAC, and other material in the plenum space beneath the floor and the ceiling of the story below. Yep, this is looking eerily similar to the exposed floors in bombed out Ramel. To conceal the interior texture of the wine box cardboard, I broke out normal all-purpose spackling paste. Dipping my fingers into water and then smoothing it into position was okay, but was a little inconsistent. Then I started using a piece of chipboard like a spatula to gather a ridge of spackling and then smear it into place and use my wet fingers to smooth it out. This was much more effective and much less messy. I applied the paste on the sides of the pilasters, around the interior of each door and window, and around the perimeter of the walls and around the balconies. I also added a little drop onto the top of the straw to cap it, with the intention of slotting in pieces of contorted wire to represent exposed rebar from when the column snapped as the building partially collapsed. I took my tray of Chenkow's Craft half pearl beads and, selecting the second largest, began to glue them into position at 4 cm intervals along the exterior pilasters. I cut out several cardboard strips that I was going to use as base in the interior, but with the derelict, devastated nature of the building that was developing, I started to question whether or not I would actually use them. I hastened the drying of the spackling with a few wafts of the hot air gun and cut some pieces of the wine box cardboard as ragged shapes to represent pieces of fallen structure that would remain flat enough to maintain stability for models placed on the ground floor. I'm painting my army and can now really appreciate how long it takes to get your miniatures parade ready, so I do not want to be responsible for someone's model repeatedly falling over on my uneven ground floor and getting chipped or scratched.
You absolute monster!
I applied spackling paste around their exteriors and then grabbed a washing up bowl and started painting on Elmer's glue before pouring on baking powder. I applied it all over, but did so a little more frugally on the floor. So this is going to be a hybrid texture, incorporating the baking soda from my choke station and the Mod Podge from my shipping silos. a squirt of black acrylic, a squirt of white acrylic, and a nice pour of Mod Podge, and I started with my big fat brush and dabbed the mixture all over, getting that nice stipple effect that was further exaggerated by the glue and baking powder base. I worked it around, getting into the nooks and crannies, of which there were many. It took several coats to get full coverage, and yes, I really don't think I'll be using the bases, as I like the way it looks as is. The weight of the paint, and from making it wet, the floors started to sag a little, so I used hot glue around the solid plastic straw to lock them in position, so I needed it after all. A friend of mine in Seattle keeps both chicken and quail, so I managed to acquire just some offcuts of his chicken wire for my own purposes. For the guardrails around the balconies, I used this chicken wire and cut out 6 strips, cut them to size and stabbed one end into the cardboard packing that I've been using to mount things on so I can prime them. I gave them a quick blast of black matte primer on each side, and while they dried, I applied my first dry brush of lighter grey to the main structure. I painted the guardrails black, inserted them into position, and the one on the upper balcony at the front, I snipped it open and bent the ends out to simulate damage, just, well, because. I continued with the dry brushing of a lighter shade, this time focusing on the sides of the pilasters and around the windows and doors and the domes, and I gave the ceiling a new coat just for thoroughness before touching up the top of the column. With the balcony guardrails in position, I gave them a light dry brush of Army Painter Mithril Silver, but overall this piece of terrain is looking a little plain. This may not be a bad thing. When it's full of figures, they'll be the focus of attention, but a few decorative indulgences might be in order. I wanted the ground floor to serve a little more feasibly as obscuring terrain, so I cut out a number of balsa wood strips and painted them with some Army Painter Bugbear Brown. In the inspirational image, I decided to replace the hammer and sickle with an Imperial Aquila. I tried cutting it out of cardboard after printing the symbol on it, but it was just too delicate and the little bits kept tearing, so I tried again with the intention of printing it and then painting it, but that also did not look quite right, so I'm shelving that idea for now. While pondering something else, I proceeded to add some darker washes to the balsa wood, and while they dried, I discovered that the mixture of Elmer's baking soda, Mod Podge and paint on top of cardboard was much thicker than the Kills primer and grouting sand on styrofoam that I used on my bunkers. So I couldn't just punch a pencil or pen into the terrain to create the bullet hole effect I liked, so I used the X-Acto blade to pierce the surface and twisted it around a couple of times, which let me then jam a pen into the penetration to create the shallow crater effect. I applied Abaddon black into the holes and then added some light grey dabs around the crater, and then used water to wash the colour out a little, blending it and getting my sporadic bullet holes. So this structure came under some token small arms fire, and when it proved too impenetrable and the defenders too well ensconced against whoever was attacking them, they brought in heavy weapons or artillery that demolished the rear, leaving only this facade standing. I dabbed the balsa wood boards in Elmer's and glued them into position to create barricades across the ground floor windows and doorway. Then I added the broken pieces of structure to the ground floor and glued them in place. On a roll with the flair.
Or your lack of flair, because I'm counting and I only see 15 pieces.
I grabbed a partial rib cage and an arm and a skull and glued them into position on the second floor by the shattered structural column, along with some chunks from my lump of dried latex. I dipped a nail into some contact cement and began rotating it to keep the glue in place. I dribbled it into position and blew on it to dry the exterior and create a shell to hold it in place and stop it seeping out. I left it to dry for a bit and then used the nail to pierce the blob and stretch out strands to connect to the surrounding area and the bones. Once the gore and connective melting tissue was dry, I gave it a base of corn red. And then a wash of Nuln oil, and then finally a dry brush of Army Painter Dragonfire Red. Finally, some dry brushing with silver on the exposed rebar wire and piping on the exposed floors, and a few Imperial posters printed up and applied by the doors for edification and inspiration and courage as you leave the safety of the building. And the last touch is going to be the Astra Militarum military emblem, which is far simpler than the Imperial Aquila I botched. So I printed it onto cardboard and cut out the wings and the skull and used the Mod Podge mixture to dab and paint them on the sides, and then glued them into position and gave them a light dry brush of the mithril silver. And here we have it, an Imperial Guard headquarters. Not just an administrative office, but a defendable position. This was proven when the shadow in the warp fell across the land and isolated the Guard from the Imperium. Aware that an attack was likely imminent, the Guard began to fortify the ground floor against intrusion, and the building echoed with the beat of nails fastening dense beams into place. The Commissar marched onto the roof and stepped out atop the exposed balcony, the emblem of the Astra Militarum beneath him. A mighty and rousing speech stirred the hearts and stilled the courage of the massed ranks before him, and then the troops filed in, sealed the doors, pounding beams across them, and took up firing positions with las guns ready. The ground and very walls started to vibrate, announcing the coming of war, and then the swarm crested the distant hills and poured forth towards them. Barrages of lasgun fire felled wave after wave of Xenos, but the tide was seemingly endless. Sporadic bioweapon fire pockmarked the dense walls of the headquarters and proved just how strong the structure was. The hive mind immediately changed tactics, and as the termagants and rippers continued to fall, Exocrine and Hiveguard took aim and unleashed brutal waves of organic artillery that rained down and levelled vast swathes of the headquarters, leaving only the front facade still standing. Hours later, in the wake of this destruction, a lone guardsman came to, buried in the rubble and forgotten. Looking around and hearing only silence, he gave thanks to the God Emperor for his good fortune and climbed up to the top floor to survey the situation and perhaps find salvation, only to hear the click and hiss of rippers in the shadows. The beasts pounced and tore him apart, leaving only a slowly dissolving heap of gore atop a desolate ruin that only days earlier had bustled with life and activity. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more silliness.